Hello, my name is Adam Zaidel. Today I'm going to show you just a quick little activity that I actually came up with from an idea that I got just from a combination of other similar lessons that I've seen either teachers or colleagues do. So I actually have a short clip a little bit later that will show you a visual example of this activity. I chose the name Down the Line, which hopefully will make sense in a few moments. Before we begin, there's a couple little things that we need to consider before we get into the bulk of the activity, or before you decide to use the activity for yourself. As you'll see in a second, the activity is very, very simple. It is easily adaptable to fit a range of topics and content areas, but best of all, it provides an authentic learning and context, and it's generally enjoyable for students as they get an opportunity to develop their language production in a fairly low impact environment. However, on the other hand, as you'll see in a moment, it can be somewhat time consuming. Add to that, students may find a little bit of an initial shock in just using the target language, so that might be a little bit challenging at first. And it might be hard in a completely distinct language that doesn't share maybe as many characteristics with the student's L1 language, such as, for example, the distinction between English and Japanese. So another thing that you may want to consider, or something that you may actually be asking me, is when can we use this activity, or what contexts are applicable to this activity? And the answer to that is actually really quite simple, and it centers around the very simple idea of communication. So you may just want to ask yourself, what does communication look like in the day-to-day, and what kind of things do you talk about, or just how do you communicate with people when you see one in the street, or when you see one in the classroom, when you see your mom, your dad, whatever it may be. So some things that may help you kind of develop ideas further is just centering around the idea of what a dialogue structure may look like. And from there, obviously, we can go to how do we converse with people? What does a conversation look like? And that's not necessarily strictly in a grammatical sense the way we might look at it as we drill activities in the classroom, but what does an authentic conversation look like? So you may want to start with just simple things like hello and goodbye. Advance slowly towards my name is if they're having trouble with just hello and goodbye, and then from there you start simple, and eventually what you'll find is you'll be able to get into some more complex conversation structures, perhaps around the idea of an interview, or you may want to start asking kids about their childhood, and at this point now you can incorporate some past tense verb forms. You may want to talk about something like goals, and now you're adapting into future tense and conditional tense. So there's a bunch of different things that you can elaborate from this simple idea of communication. But that's where we start. So the big question at this point becomes, kind of what is the point of this activity? What is the big idea behind it? And as we kind of touched about a little bit earlier, the biggest benefit of this activity is it puts you in a real life context right away, and it gets students developing their language inside of a real life context, inside of an authentic context, rather than drilling from a textbook and then trying to apply that later into a real context. I know many students will do that kind of. So now we'll look a little bit more at the essential steps that we may want to consider when we actually get into the formal aspect of this activity. So the first step that we're going to want to consider is we're going to want to think of what our dialogue is going to look like. And some things that we may want to consider in how a dialogue is structured and how we're going to teach it is just start with something small. Obviously, we need to build a base from which we can later build upon. So we can think of Krashen's input hypothesis, his idea around comprehension. So we want to put it just at a level just above what they're currently able to produce on their own, so it's not too hard, but it is just beyond their level. And with that, we're obviously incorporating Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Go hand in hand in a lot of ways in this context. And obviously within both of those ideas comes the necessary element of the authentic environment. So again, we want to combine all that. So we want to think about a fairly simple dialogue structure that is just beyond their levels currently, and something that they can grow into So not something way too hard out of reach, but something that they can achieve within the context of your lesson. So essentially at this point, you've selected a simple dialogue. Like we kind of mentioned earlier, it might be as simple as, hello, my name is Adam. Nice to meet you. That might be as simple as you go for this lesson if you're dealing with an intro student. At this point, you're going to break that down. So you're going to break that entire, whatever your chosen dialogue is, you're going to break that down into logical components that you can then break apart into almost like steps that students will go through. Because what you're going to end up doing is you're going to repeat just those individual chunks, and what you're doing at this point that is kind of the idea of chunking. And as you move on to each subsequent chunk, you're actually repeating what you previously learned. So this really helps students' comprehension and their own production, and it's doing it in a fairly authentic, passive way, because when you think about how you teach your children at a young age to speak their first language for the first time, this is very much similar to what we do. Some other things that you may want to consider when you're breaking down a dialogue is obviously some of the obstacles that you might run into. So that's what this is the hardest step in my personal opinion, because it's impossible for us to fully envision what obstacles, barriers. We may not consider certain areas that they may struggle. We may think that they will struggle in certain areas. So really this is a difficult one, but a common one that we often see when learning a second language is dealing around the idea of phonetics and new sounds. So for example, in Polish, to say hello, we would say dzień dobry. But for an English speaker that has never heard an Eastern European Slavic sort of language or has no experience in it, they may be completely confused and might not even catch what you're saying. So essentially you may have to break down that word into individual sounds. So you might start at dzień dobry, and you might write it on the board, you may not, but you may just start with just having students j, and then eng to get that jing, the first part, down, and you may even go a little bit further and give them some sort of representation of what that sound is supposed to be. So for the J, for dzień dobry, you may just ask them to say the word jeep a couple times so that they can really connect to what that sound is supposed to sound like. Obviously, planning for these kind of obstacles and barriers, it's not easy, and it is going to take a lot of experience. But as that experience comes, you'll be able to find ways to prepare yourself in advance for areas that students may struggle. And that's the entire idea of planning for obstacles. It's not necessarily knowing exactly what's going to happen, when's going to happen, because we know that that's not how learning takes place in any environment. It's just being prepared for what might happen and how we may respond to it. And step 4, the last thing that we may want to consider is specifically your role in facilitating this activity. Because you're going to be using the target language as much as possible, consider your physical directions and your gestures, your body language, how you're going to use all those visual cues to help your students access something that's going to sound completely new. Obviously, to say that it's going to sound foreign to them is a limit, because it will. So that's what you're going to want to consider. So how you're going to point to them, maybe you want to wave, use simple gestures that span cross-culturally, use simple motions, things like that. But that's something that you're going to want to keep in mind before you go into this lesson, just because typically when we teach, we don't really think about that, especially if we're teaching in a language that everybody already understands. Not needed at that point. And it's hard sometimes to consider that the student that we're speaking to isn't going to understand what we're saying. So this is where physical directions, the idea of like the total physical response theory really comes into play here. So again, to recap, in case you forgot, you might be in the middle of exams, you might be really busy with marking, whatever it is. So if you're still asking yourself, why is this important? Again, back to what we talked about earlier. It literally takes learning outside from your typical classroom setting, where a lot of students might not enjoy your lecture format, whatever it is, and it places them right out onto the street or into a movie theater or whatever, because it's putting them in an authentic situation which you have pre-planned already. Allows students to access the new language that they're learning with. So now we're actually going to take a look at the activity. So first of all, what you're going to want to do is just go over the same dialogue that you had originally in the chunks that you kind of pre-established. So this will just probably be a basic repeat after me sort of thing, just to introduce students to what they're going to be doing in the down the line activity. So taking those kind of blocks that you pre-established, all you're going to do is you're probably going to just get them to repeat after you, just basic steps. So hello, hello, hello. And then from there, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to establish your game. So you'll get everyone in a line, and using your physical gestures, they'll follow along really quick. They really do. And from there, you're going to model both parts of the dialogue. So you're going to hop back and forth, and then after that, you'll just go through everyone in line with that first chunk of the dialogue. Once you're at the back, you'll just point to the person at the front, and then it's their turn to go. So it's pretty easy. They pick up on it really quick. Your job as the facilitator at this point is just to correct students, catch little errors that they have in production. Nothing too major, because at this point all we're focusing on is comprehensible. As long as you can understand it, that is what we're aiming for. And again, at the front of the line, as the teacher, you just introduce whatever the next chunk of your dialogue is, and you kind of just go through it at whatever pace you decide the students require to master that content for that lesson. And yeah, so to give you guys maybe a better visual example of what this is going to look like, here's a quick little video of a Polish lesson that I actually did with another class. So keep in mind that none of these kids have absolutely any background in Polish. They don't know any Polish language at all.
Bardzo dobrze, bardzo dobrze. No to chodźcie tutaj, wszyscy, chodź. Chodźcie tutaj, chodźcie. Tutaj przede mną. Chodźcie. No, bardzo dobrze. No to teraz ja pójdę pierwszy przez każdego, tak? I ja to zrobię wszystko, co teraz zrobiliśmy, tak? Dzień dobry, jestem Adam, miło mi. Wy nic nie musicie powiedzieć, tak? Dzień dobry. Jestem Adam, miło mi. Dzień dobry, 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 jestem Adam, miło mi. I ja teraz idę do końca i teraz ty idziesz, tak? Tak.
Dzień dobry, jestem Dylan, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Dzień dobry, jestem Dylan, miło mi. Dzień dobry, jestem Dylan, miło mi. Dzień dobry, jestem Dylan, miło mi.
Dobrze. Teraz ty. Tak.
Dzień dobry, jestem Morgan, miło mi.
Dobrze. Dobrze.
Dzień dobry, jestem Morgan, miło mi. Dzień dobry, jestem Morgan, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Dzień dobry.
Dzień
dobry, jestem Morgan, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Dzień dobry, jestem Tanner, miło mi. Dzień dobry, jestem Jeff Tanner. To
Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry, jestem Tanner.
Miło mi.
Miło mi.
Miło.
Jestem dobry, jestem Tanner, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Okay. Dzień dobry, jestem Carolyn, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Dzień dobry, jestem Carolyn, miło mi. Dzień dobry, jestem Carolyn, miło mi.
Dobrze.
Dzień dobry, jestem Carolyn, miło mi.
Dzień dobry, jestem Arthur, miło mi.
Miło.
Miło mi.
Miło. Tak.
Dzień dobry, jestem Arthur, miło mi.
Miło.
Miło mi.
Miło.
Dzień dobry, jestem Arthur, miło mi.
Miło.
Miło.
Got it.
Dzień dobry, jestem Arthur, miło mi.
So hopefully this was useful, and hopefully you find a way to adapt it to whatever context you're using it in. Again, it's very authentic, very low impact, and it's a ton of fun. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and use the down the line activity as much as your heart desires. Thank you.